Hello, everyone. Today we're going to have a lecture on a second social contract by María Vieira Cortada. Uh, this lecture is going to examine the concept of the second social contract in light of the lack of international human rights and guarantees. Maria, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for being here. Well, first about me, my name is María Vieira Cortada. I am a student of fifth year in University Carlos III de Madrid, and I study a double degree in political science and international studies. I've been a member of the student research committee in political theory since October last year, I think. And this work is some work that I did for a subject in 2021. The subject was called International Contemporary Conflicts, and I had to hand it in May 21. It was a very much larger essay. And then in September 21, I submitted it for a contest, and I got a second prize in December 1 year ago. And now, some days, just a few days ago, I got told that finally it's published. So you can also look for it on the internet. So this is the context of this very modest research I did. Um, so first, I'm gonna introduce a bit how did I reach this topic. So basically, as an international relations student, sorry, I'm hearing my notification. Okay. Is my screen still shared? Wait. Yeah,
Yes.
okay. Okay, thank you. Sorry. So I heard a lot about the debate of whether the UN is useless, it doesn't have any power or enforcement mechanisms, any force at all, international public law and human rights being kind of void of implications and sometimes even of legal and political content. So while I could agree with this, I thought that it was like the debate, it was just stagnated there, and that was the end of it. And that kind of status quo was, I thought it was very biased towards realist statements and towards a world that is not working in many senses, as we will see now. So then the questions that motivated this research were concerning the human rights legal system. So, for example, how can we have binding conventions that have been signed and ratified by so many states, yet we have so many different kind of human rights violations all over the world, and there's no kind of changing to it. We still have, for example, a lot of autocratic countries, and there's no big change happening on them. Another question I had is why, if there's these global texts where they guarantee my rights as a person just for the fact that I am a person, why then do my rights change if I put one of my feet in France? What how do they change if I move to, for example, Iran? Why does my catalog of rights and liberties, if it's guaranteed by a global text, change so much if I change the state I am in? So basically, these were kind of the questions, and then yeah, just how can we escape the system we're in now? Then, if we want to, how can we change it? So this is what I was thinking about, and before starting, I want to present some of my limitations. The first one is that I'm going to be covering very dense concepts such as nation state, human rights, international law. They're all very, very, very deep concepts that I could devote a whole paper in just defining them. Then it's a very structural topic, and that's why we have a paella next to the text. And I use this metaphor to explain that if international politics is paella, which is the Spanish dish you can see in the slide, some work is, for example, on the different parts of the rice, on shrimps, for example, on mussels. So like the WTO, a specific treaty, a specific agreement. My work, or what I try to do, is about the pan itself. So it's a very structure-focused work, and this means that sometimes I really want to dig in deeper inside the dish, but I can't because I'm just focusing on the pan. So you'll see this further when I explain some other things. And then lastly, my literature review. And again, the whole time I could devote to this, I was just telling Nestor that like yesterday I was doing a paper on stata, sorry. So my time was very limited, and I'm going to be covering very big authors such as Kant, Habermas, or Hobbes, whose literature I don't know at all in a full sense. So I'm going to be specifying what I'm referring to. And yeah, so just take into account that this is a very modest research, and I'm going to try to make it as serious as I can, but also just a bit more chill, because I think this is what the work I did deserves. So let's get into it. We started off thinking about the international reality. So the international political and legal system is very complex. It is interdependent, and the UN was created a bit on the warning that we couldn't solve certain issues without a joint action. Here, I really like this quote I wrote here by Ulrich Beck, saying that when we think of the cosmopolitan events that have changed the world over the 25 last years, and he refers to, for example, the fall of the Berlin Wall or the Arab Spring, or now we could say COVID, they have two things in common. First, that if they happen unexpectedly and unpredictably, it's because they fall into categories that go beyond our conventional imagination, and that they all have global and transnational implications. So what we're going to try to do is to revise and review those categories and propose new complementary ones. So let's start with our theoretical basis, which is the social contracts theory and Kantian theory. In Kant, I have to specify that I'm going to be referring to the essay on perpetual peace. So what's the social contract? So social contract theories are those who base the order, the social political order and structure of society on an imaginary pact between individuals and a superior sovereign. And depends on the author, we'll find, for example, Locke that says it's a parliament, but Hobbes says it's an absolute monarch. Before this pact, we have a state of nature. So this state of nature is defined by the lack of regulation and a lack of a mechanism of coercion other than the law of the strongest. So this means that if I have a house and there's a big strong man in front of me that wants my house, he can get it if he can beat me. So it's really just unfair for those who are weak, and the privilege it doesn't matter where the privilege comes from. It just comes from being more able to harm the other and to be more harmful than the other. So what happens is that to guarantee their security and also in some sort their freedom, here they also focus, the authors normally focus on the term private property. They conduct this contract, this pact, and they establish what then we'll see will be the nation state and a sovereign nation state more concretely. And here below the contract, I wrote that it's I want to make a nuance here that the word contract in theory, it's very used, and it kind of depoliticizes a theory. So making it look like what is resulting from the contract, in this case the state, is something neutral, which doesn't have to be, and we'll see it afterwards. So what happens in the sovereign state? So we have the sovereign state is artificial, it's not natural like the state of nature. There's law and there's its guarantee. It's what Kant considered to be a sort of extended state of extended freedom. And it's also important to note that the state is not per se the end of violence, but it's the entity that appropriates the violence and therefore limits and rationalizes it in a delimited population and space. So what happens if we move this social contract theory to the international arena? Does international violence and conflicts, do they happen because we don't have a sovereign in the international arena? So if states are born through war and violence to stop them and to guarantee security of its individuals, what about international contemporary wars? Maybe we could say, oh yeah, there's the UN, but the UN has no sovereign power as the state would have, or no coercive mechanism. Here I put into brackets the UN Security Council because someone could argue that that's a coercive mechanism. I argue that it's not, but this is I will be out of time, but we can discuss this later. It's very interesting. So if we follow Hobbes, in nature, men try to guarantee their integrity through the exercise of force in order to impose their dominion over the other and reduce as much as possible threats. So I thought that this was very consistent with the history of international relations and with the very nature of geopolitics. Thus, the absence of regulation of violence consolidates a hierarchy of privileges based on individual power. Remember the strong big man, regardless of its origins. And the only way to escape it is to regulate it, though it always comes with the sacrifice of certain freedom. For example, that big man is actually free in the state of nature to come to my house and steal it. So we kind of sacrifice some freedoms, but we understand that it is greater to get security and other freedoms in exchange. So what does Kant say about this? So in a very, very reduced way, because this is a very long part that I developed in the work, but that I don't have time to do here. So Kant conceived the state as a result of a community that has a legitimate power to command and dispose over itself. So it has a first limit and a first moral duty, which is the categorical imperative, which, if very briefly, is the axis of Kant's ethics. I don't want to do. I will not do to others what I don't want them to do to me. So this applies to everyone, regardless of, for example, sex, nationality, or origin, ethnicity, etc. So he equates the state to an individual who, if this is true over himself, would lose this capacity it has as a moral person. So what we have to understand here, like the summary of this summary, is that the state has also moral implications itself, and it can also gather moral responsibilities. So if the imperative applies to every individual, no one must remain in the state of nature, because we saw that the state of nature is not safe, and this is not compatible with the categorical imperative. So the paradox here is that the states themselves are still in a state of nature. So what Kant says is that he proposes this federation of nations as a solution, and kind of like the Federation of Nations could walk, so the UN could run. So what is this Federation of Nations? So it seeks to ensure that states do not go to war. This is the main problem he thinks of war, despite the lack of a supranational jurisdiction. So he thinks that democracies, which normally he refers to as countries with nations with republican constitutions, they're inherently peaceful, he thinks, and their foreign policy must also be so. And then he thinks of this federation as a voluntary association of states, in which, and in no way the federation, because then remember what we said before, that they would lose their capacity to be a moral individual, the states. The federation cannot force them to take any course of action different than the one they would take themselves. So does this sound familiar? It is really familiar, because it's really similar to the UN. So I will argue here that it's not a good thing that the UN is Kantian in this sense. Why? So the UN was created to prevent future wars after World War II, and public international law, and the one that, especially the one that the UN emits, has proved to have a lot of cracks and has proved to be very, very weak in its implementation. Because normally they're not binding. Those resolutions that lead us closer to what Kant called the perpetual peace, they're not normally not binding, such as the Declaration of Human Rights. But furthermore, those who are binding, they cannot be enforced as a state would. So the state mediates between those human rights mandates and their implementation. And this is one of the main problems we have here. We'll see it afterwards. So it could be said that the UN turned out to be finally the federation that Kant said, in the sense that states are there a bit voluntarily. It cannot enforce really a lot of things. Again, we could bring up the UN Security Council. If that's a doubt you have, we can also discuss it later, why I'm not taking that into account. So we'll finish this very brief theory review with a very nice quote of Kant saying, where there's no common power, law does not exist. Where there's no law, there's no justice. And I think this really sums up the idea I'm trying to put here of like what the main lack of the international system is. So what's wrong with the nation state? What's wrong with the nation state mediating human rights in text and legal documents? So the state, remember, is still in a state of nature within other other states. So and this we'll see later, it also has a repercussion on the individuals, not only the states among themselves. So if the questions that arise now are, if all individuals possess a series of rights that apply to them as humans, regardless of accidentalities such as gender, race, and nationality, what justifies as belonging to a political community implies a series of rights different from another political community. Should states be able to disengage from their actions if these are justified by their sovereign will and the claim of the principle of non-intervention, which is the very main premise of international public law? Why would a state resist an external mechanism to ensure compliance with human rights? If why would they not want to have human rights help from another one, right? If they just want to guarantee that their individuals and their population is safe. Obviously, here I have to make a nuance again, and it's that when we say an external compliance mechanism, we would be talking about a different institutions than we have the ones we have, because they actually prove to not be very good in it. This is one of the things in the paella I expressed in the beginning that I would like to dig deeper in, but I have to stick to the pan. So as a conclusion, the modern state is both the negation of the state of nature, like within itself, domestically, but it's also the affirmation of the state of nature towards the international system. So what other things are wrong with the state of nature? Wrong is a very strong word, so let's say the cons. We need new forms of analysis. So there's new forms of international violence and subjectivity that escape the classical classification of a state. For example, indigenous people, occupied territories, grouped with armed groups with territorial control, even migrants and refugees are concepts that stem from the very concept of a nation state and frontier. So another thing is that the asymmetries between nation states in many senses, but here what we are talking about is human rights. They also come from the fact that all states are sovereign, but some states are more sovereign than others. It's not a perfect horizontality, and this has repercussions. Like we can agree that the US is very sovereign, while for example, Kosovo, maybe it's not that much. So in short, the problem can be summarized at the circle of individuals affected by the policy of a state is different from the circle of individuals who can actively claim rights from that state and intervene and influence their government if it were democratic. So the thing here is that sovereignty is so enshrined within international law that precisely when the latter wants to act, for example, when it wants to say, hey, you're violating human rights, you're violating this convention that is pending that you ratified, the state practically always, not to say always, finds a escape route in the inviolability of sovereignty itself. So it's like a snake that bites its tongue all the time. There's no way out, or so, or so that's or so that's what it's thought, right? So this is what we're trying to answer here now, which is the cosmopolitan alternative. So what do we mean here by cosmopolitanism? So very briefly, again, this is another topic I would like to dig in, but I don't have time, and it's also out of my scope. But very briefly, here we refer to political, social, legal, and moral theory that advocates the deep cooperation of different international actors to achieve global common objectives. So in this political dimension, cosmopolitanism advocates a democratic perspective of the international order, so that individuals are cosmopolitans, which is citizens of the world, literally, because they have a right to choose their representatives, among other rights, and they have duties as citizens of that democratic cosmos. So the moral basis here is the intrinsic value of the person as an end in itself, and as a subject of rights because of their own humanity. And cosmopolitanism proposes a global order in which human rights are an operative principle of justice, as well as the teleology of institutions of any institution of governance. So it also implies a new methodology. We were talking about this before. So I read a lot in realist literature, something like, well, the state is not perfect, but it is the most effective way so far to guarantee rights. Or also like how is international law gonna work if we don't have states? You know, the state is the best subject for international law, and this is a bit of a tautology because it's a bit in a very like colloquial way. It's like saying that apple is good for an apple pie. So the object of the apple pie is to put a apple in a pie. International law was made internationes, was made for the states themselves, with the main premise of sovereignty and of the inviolability of that sovereignty. In this sense, the theory we're proposing here, it has this kind of deconstructivist touch to it. So additionally, and this is again another very interesting topic for discussion, cosmopolitan realizations are localized. So it's paradoxically post-universalist. And I think this is very well expressed by Seyla Ben-Habib, saying that cosmopolitanism, the concern for the world as if it was a single polis, it's amplified by the multiple overlapping allegiances held across different communities of diverse language, ethnicity, religion, and nationality. And here I like to talk about this idea Martha Nussbaum talks about. She brings back the Stoics, and what they said is that the person individual has certain circles, concentric circles of loyalty around him, herself, themselves. So the closest circle, it will be probably their family, their friends. The next one, maybe it's their city or even their neighborhood. The next one, maybe their ethnicity, their religion, etc., etc. Till we reach the last one, which will be the circle of humanity. So what the most naive cosmopolitanism wants to do is to put this last humanity circle as the first one. But what we should do is to make those circles come closer between each other. And it is very idealistic, but it just notes it just notes that we are all subject and linked to some degree to global events and phenomena. So the violation of the rights of one individual, and this is the very importance of having this subjective unit, is a violation of the rights of all. It's very individualistic, but it's also radically inclusive. So it realizes that the international violence does not begin with wars. That was what mainly Kant saw when he studied international law, or what was there at the moment. It does not begin in wars and crimes prohibited by jus cogens, but it rather begins in that very first circle of allegiances, and that's where, let's say, the cosmopolitan methodology and epistemology sorry, puts the focus on. So, and very briefly, what happens then with international law? Again, the subject becomes the individual and not the state. So, and then if we would go further in this, again, another thing I would like to dig deeper in the future is how could we arrange a sort of global constitutionalism that, of course, its subject would be the individual, the person. So finally, we reach what gives the title to the lecture, which is a second social contract. So what is the second social contract? With this, I seek to establish a parallel with the first one, but changing a bit the scenario and changing a bit the actors that are involved in it. So in the first social contract, it is the individuals who, in order to protect themselves and to have security and certainty, they bind themselves together in what will become the nation state. So in the second social contract, individuals bind themselves globally to obtain the guarantee of their rights and security. As we saw before, one of the difficulties, challenges, but also good points of cosmopolitanism is, and the reform of international public law, is to take a different epistemological stance. So consistent with this, the subject of this contract is not the state. It is all the actors involved in the global sphere, but this includes the very basic one, which is the individual. That's why it's because it's among individuals and not among states themselves. So yeah, here I have, oh, sorry, I forgot the last thing. So basically in the first social contract, individuals give up part of their freedom and autonomy to guarantee their security under the state apparatus. And in the second one, the price to pay is another kind of freedom. It's kind of the freedom of states themselves, but here we're gonna address it as sovereignty. That's what's sacrificed. So here I made a conceptual scheme for this. So first, just like a little warning, which is that the purpose of this scheme is not to give an account of the international reality or nothing like that. It's just to systematize a bit the arguments I held before, and also to just let's say structure it a bit more. And you'll see I'll talk about A, B, and C, and I just want to clarify that between A, B, and C there are a lot of gray areas. So these are ideal types. So figure 1 corresponds to the first social contract in which the state has the power to bend and coerce people, and concretely persons A, B, and C. A, who could be a national, can claim his rights to the state. B, on the other hand, is within territorial sovereignty, which is the square, but not necessarily among popular sovereignty, which is the circle. So, sorry, I said it the wrong way. I'm so sorry. B is within territorial sovereignty, but which is the circle, but not within popular sovereignty, which is the square. It could be, for example, a migrant. And then C represents the previous case, but in a more extreme way, which is, for example, a stateless person who does not even have a nation of reference. It could also apply to someone who is a refugee and has not been granted asylum. It also could refer to someone, well, that's a refugee, that is not recognized, but their home nation, home country. So this person has not even a country to refer to claim their rights to, not even a country he or she is in at that moment, but their origin is also not recognized and does not include the catalog of rights and freedom for them. So international jurisdiction has been represented by a broken line because of the lack of a dash line, sorry, because of the lack of implementation power that characterizes it, as we talked before. Consequently, in terms of rights, A is bigger than B, then it's bigger than C. So the relationship between these persons and their rights and between them themselves is based on the relation they have with the state. So their privileges and their place in the hierarchy, in this case, it's all defined by the relation that, again, they have with the state, both the state they find themselves in and also the state they are original from, state of reference. So in figure 2, we see the proposal of the second social contract. So here, international jurisdiction is coercive, but in this case, both at the individual level and at the state level. But in return, all of them, A, B, and C, can claim their rights to it, regardless of their relationship with the state of precedent of reference or the state they find themselves inside. So therefore, in this scenario, we would equate the rights of the three persons. So A would be equal to B to C. And then we, hypothetically, this contract would take place within international institutions whose administration, legislation, and executive power would be rooted in the will of the subjects who have consented them. So here, it's interesting to know that, again, Selaven Habib says that we have already kind of entered a phase like that in a very subtle way, because there's many ways in which the state is already bended and linked to obligations, to international obligations already. So, for example, I think the most clear example is the European Union, though I know it's a regional system, but it shows how this would kind of look like. So I'm almost at the end of it. So I'm gonna present a couple more categories that I think could be interesting for the analysis. So let's go back to all the arguments I showed here. So the world is interconnected, it's interdependent, and its inequalities and asymmetries of power have given rise to insufficient regulations of violence, often unjust and inconsistent with its moral basis, which is human rights. However, the status quo is maintained thanks to the state system, which prevents a policy of violence management and of human rights guarantee free of privilege. So from this and from the previous arguments, we can deduce equality, that is that we are actually somehow already a bit already cosmopolitans. Why? Insofar as we are affected by what happens outside our borders, and it doesn't matter how sovereign our states are, they have an increasing quantity of topics, phenomena that they cannot issues that they cannot just manage autonomously without joint action. And also, if we are to look at a country that does not, for example, recognize us as a person, we would, or as an individual entitled to rights, the last soldier between us and zero rights would be actually international conventions, and more concretely, the Declaration of Human Rights. So we are, in some sense, passively cosmopolitan. So this is what I called a negative cosmopolitanism, which is characteristic of the which is characteristic of the international system before this hypothetical second social contract. So this is in line with what Kant said, called the right to hospitality. So if I am a peaceful person, I can be in another country. That does not mean that I can access the catalog of rights, freedoms, and services the people from there have. Other examples are climate change, insofar as it is a global phenomenon that involves every inhabitant of the planet to varying degrees, or paradoxically, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because it is universal, but it's not binding. So this is an example of the framework of negative cosmopolitanism. So the main problem with this is that although we are citizens of the world, insofar as what happens in there affects us, there are very few ways we can actually decide about it or what to do about it, which, for example, would imply spoiler positive cosmopolitanism. So it's not negative cosmopolitanism, it's not detrimental in itself, as negative freedom or liberty is not, or the negative conception of peace is not. It's just not enough. So, on the other hand, positive cosmopolitanism refers to the development of institutions, legislation, and even forms of culture that promote the joint management of global affairs, and has emerged as a response to this deficit. So in short, we could call it as a sort of global governance. So it's an active cosmopolitanism, which brings us closer to this hypothetical second social contract, and which seeks to politicize this global phenomena, international texts that have been remained static, for example, as the Declaration of Human Rights, and to make international flows and interdependencies a matter subject to democratic political debate. So it basically aims at putting an end to that state of nature. So this is precisely what positive cosmopolitanism seeks. So since the cosmopolitization of the conditions of life, which is negative, would be part of the negative side of cosmopolitanism, does not necessarily imply that it's a voluntary process, nor does it imply the development, for example, of an international cosmopolitan consciousness or mentality, which would be, on the other hand, part of the positive realm. So here, the most advanced example of this positive cosmopolitanism would be, again, the system of protection of rights of the Council of Europe, and more concretely, the Court of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, because it's actually international in the sense that covers countries in a region, but the applicant can be individual, and it doesn't matter what country of the region he or them are from. But also another example of positive cosmopolitanism is the Security Council, insofar as it has a certain kind of binding ability. So this actually shows the importance that positive cosmopolitanism has to be hand in hand with democracy and pluralism, and that is, as well as negative cosmopolitanism is not all bad, this is also not all good. So this is, in short, to understand that transnational duties go beyond states and go beyond war and peace, but they also concern other equally fundamental issues without which there's no peace either, such as economic justice, environmental crisis, or the processes of democratization. So cosmopolitan regulation must aim to find definitions and coercive prosecution for those issues, as well as new proposals, especially for the institutional design of how would those institutions look like, and how would they emit that regulation. And here I'll conclude this section with a nice Habermas quote saying that human rights fundamentalism is not avoided by renouncing the politics to the politics of human rights. This is where I said at the beginning, that the debate was stagnated in, but only by the used cosmopolitan transformation of a state of nature among states into a legal order. So before I conclude, I would just mention the main critic here, which is that is highly unrealistic. Here, an Italian philosopher that I follow a lot because he talks a lot about global cosmopolitanism. He's Luigi Ferrajoli. He says that realistically speaking, this all cannot last. And with this, he refers to the fact that there's a vast literature on global issues, on global problems that respond to this structure and that are maintained by this structure if they're not caused directly by it. So being realist here is very biased towards status quo, and we have data, we have numbers, and we have studies showing that the status quo has a lot of problems. Like the most urgent one would be climate action. So I also think that here it's not exactly the dichotomy of realism and utopia does not exactly apply here, because there's many ways in which this has progressed. And I showed the example of the European Court of Human Rights, which would have been unthinkable of many years before. So we are in somehow seeing some little insights of that second social contract. So in that sense, it's not that it's just unreal or real. It's just happening slowly, not steadily, but there's a way to continue. So as Ulrich Beck suggests, we're not living in a cosmopolitan era. We are in a moment of cosmopolitization. So to conclude, the UN and Kant, I started with this. So the UN is accidentally Kantian insofar as it seeks international peace, but it does not ultimately bend sovereign states and lacks democratic mechanism or of coercion. As a consequence, at the international level, there is still a residual state of nature. So in the state of nature, we argued, freedom is limited, security is also very limited because the strongest always wins. So thus the states that benefit from the asymmetries of this state of nature don't wish to abandon it. Thus the state, as well as the international system of states, also called the system of collective security, is neither secure nor free. And then as a political proposal, cosmopolitanism seeks to regulate this through the reduction of asymmetries of powers, among others, not in favor of specific states, but of individuals. And then in order to achieve this, it needs two main tools, which evidence the lacks of the system, which are first, international legislation of a binding and coercive nature, and second, democratic institutions to issue such legislation and provide the relevant, the pertinent coercive mechanisms. And this would imply a second social contract, which is the constitutionalization of international law and society. And to finish with, there's this quote by Victoria Camps at the beginning of the first chapter of the book After Virtue by Alasdair MacIntyre, and she says the following: I think that knowing how to combine the universality of human rights and the diversity in the way that they are put into practice is a real challenge of our time. The transition from the modern self, the abstract liberal individual, to the we that we need must be based on the reaffirmation of human rights that are, above all, the rights of the individual wherever he or she or they may be. And we could add, it doesn't matter what political community they belong to, because this is what we have been defending during all this work, which is what Anna Arendt would call the right to have rights. And I think that's it. So I don't know if any of you guys have any questions, points of, I don't know, anything you want to add or comment. It's always welcome. Any constructive criticism is also very welcome. Yeah, but on my side, that's it.
I have a couple of questions and a couple of comments, if you're okay with it. Yeah, okay. So my first question while listening to you focused on the point where you said that we need to have a more of a coercive, perhaps, system in how international law is applied. Combining that with the comment that you made about strong nations and strong actors in general not wanting to sacrifice part of their power. does it affect perhaps the applicability of the theory that you have introduced? If you take the United States as an example, every time that they sign a treaty, they put a lot of terms and conditions in it. Oh, I'm going to sign the treaty on human rights, but if I break part of it, you can't really prosecute me. If I take the wrong turn, you can't do anything. If one of the strongest countries in the world that has a lot of coercive power themselves just puts terms and conditions into place, how exactly could we not just talk about, but also apply a more coercive system?
Yeah, I don't know if you want to do a second question before I answer, or I should answer that one.
I think my second question, it's directly
As
linked.
you want.
I think it's directly linked to the first one because while you were talking, I was thinking about, again, when you were talking about how the strong don't want to sacrifice more of their freedom and don't want to abandon, the power. What I was thinking about was the theory of balance of power and how when supposedly one country is getting is gathering a lot of power, the others, at least in the region, usually band together to kind of, at least in theory, to defend off the threat. But again, seeing it now, if you take, for example, China in East Asia and in Southeast Asia as well, and perhaps the US in what we call, quote unquote, the Western world, that doesn't really seem to happen. So if the strong is supported by pretty much everyone in the region, but also globally, as someone who examines international relations from a realism point of view, I'm having a hard time following the train of thought. My final point was more of an individual level because you said that it is also considered like also an individual level of sacrifice is needed, or perhaps a matter like a sacrifice in terms of sovereignty. And every other international organization or anything along these lines that gets introduced also demands some sort of sacrifice in terms of freedom and sovereignty. But nothing really seems to work. That sounds a bit mean, but it doesn't. Look at the state of the world. So why would anyone want to sacrifice even more freedom and even more sovereignty? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think you made the main questions. So basically, and I always thought of this, so I'll try to answer it as best as I can, but I also know that this is kind of what I would like to study from now on. Now I have this theoretical framework. I'd like to study how can we make those institutions, how can they work, and how can they be better than the ones we have, which is a very complex topic. So about the applicability of the theory, obviously it's and that is still why I still think that it's idealistic. It's not fully utopian, but it's quite idealistic because and also you notice this when you get into the cosmopolitan literature, there's so many things that have been said similar to mine so many years and nothing has happened at all, or yeah, some things have happened. So the thing is that the thing is, I don't know how to explain it now. So we cannot see a change from it. It would not look like a start from it would ideally be a start from scratch thing where we magically happen to have an institution that is I think I haven't done much research on this so far, but what looks how it looks like in my head is an international democratic institutions where people from all over the world decide in a kind of international parliament. It would look I know it sounds a bit sketchy. It is because I haven't done the research on this that much. So it would look like something like that, and then it could decide on how to resolve, for example, an international conflict. But it also could decide, for example, on how maybe a government that is violating human rights cannot be in government. So, for example, it's not only a matter of war. It's not only a matter of hegemons. It's also a matter of individuals. Of like, it's okay if China is respected by all the other powers around it, and they're all in this kind of same current. So there's no apparent conflict. What we care about from this perspective is that people in China are not having the rights, and we are just allowing it. But of course, this is very conflictive because it's a very white savior thing to say. So we would need an institution that really, really balances this. The problem here is that how do we reach the making of that institution is practically impossible given our reality. And I would like to say that if I do more and more research, I'll find a way through it, but it's very difficult. It's something very difficult to change. But at the same time, if we look at for example, the European Union, there has been a lot of advance on that. And there has been, for example, they have given up the most basic one because it's how it started with their their monetary autonomy, which is a very big thing to give up for a sovereign state. So I think it could very gradually gravitate toward that, but I think the most significant change that could be made someday soon could be, for example, to deeply reform the UN, for example, because I find that the existence, the only institution that could be a bit more similar to that in terms of what they can do is the Security Council, and it's a very, very unfair institution. So I know this does not fully respond to your question of how could it be benefit, how would be, not only how could we change it, but why would we change it? I think it's more difficult for me to answer how would we change it, that why would we change it, because I still argue that even if there's peace in terms of absence of war, there's still, so like most people are, like not most people, but there's a lot of autocracies in the world that, for example, are not challenged. So it's not only a matter of not war, but just guaranteeing rights to in an individual level. I don't know if I hope I slightly satisfied your questions with this.
You did. Thank you very much for your answer.
You can go on, like the person that has their hand up, you can ask.
Hello, am I audible? Oh, hello, Maria. This is Ali. Thank you very much for your interesting discussion. And I'm also a student of Peace and Complex Studies. And I think I have a comment to make that regarding the second social contract, that our imagination of international institutions slash collaborations, or to say second social contract, is so much dominated by the model of system of UN that it is becoming increasingly difficult to think beyond that. For instance, even when we conduct student simulations, it is based on model of United Nations. So, and we also know that, and it is becoming clearly evident that UN as a system has its flaws, and that are exploited by few countries, and definitely it is damaging more countries than few. So the model we are do you think the model we are following right now needs to be reimagined, or in terms of international collaborations, the model we are following right now?
Yeah, I don't know if you wanted to say something else, or that's the question.
No, thank you. Yeah, that's my question.
Okay. Yeah, I really like this question. I think it's a very interesting question. So basically, this is kind of the always argued bias about cosmopolitanism, and it's, for example, it's Western, liberal, universalistic, white male character. It originally it has been like that, and though for example, I've revised many authors that if you want to read, they're very interesting. Like the one I mentioned a lot, Sayla Ben Habib or Bafba or Apia. They basically talk about critical and more for example racial aware cosmopolitanism. So Here, I base myself on very Western authors, but obviously I do it for a reason. So it's not that much that the moral theory I'm using to back my arguments and to back this social contract is what should be for all of us, but it's what will get us there. And why is this important? Because as I thought of it, that social contract would imply that every individual has a saying on what happens. And if you think of the world, the reason why the main individuals that said what was going to happen were Westerns were because they were stronger, they were richer, they had more privilege than others, and their voices were more represented in many institutions. And you can see, for example, this at the WTO system, where the US has almost veto power on everything, or even in the Security Council. So while this is a Western theory, because obviously I'm a Western person, so it would be very difficult for me to suddenly have such a different opinion. I'm trying to, though. It leads us to institutions that would make a seat to everyone. And if you see the world, there's more people that are not Western than Western people, for example. And I'm equating Western to Kantian base, because normally it's the tradition we carry with ourselves. But if in a parliament we put seats to everyone, for example, in a proportional manner, imagine this institution, actually there would be more people that are not Western that could have a voice there. So at the end of the day, we would end up being more minoritarian group, and thus other kind of morals and ethics could be put forward. So it is about its potentiality, not that much about the fact that it has to be the moral. So that's why. But I also think that maybe we could actually reach this point. I mean, that other morals can also have this potentiality to provide with this idea of an institution where ethics have to be discussed. But as I said before, when I talked about positive cosmopolitanism, a point as well is that we have to rethink and submit to political debate constantly the legal text and the law we're following. And that means that then we would discuss, that's why I said that we had to discuss static international law, such as the 1948 human rights that, for example, were absolutely not trans inclusive, or just had, for example, less focus on race. So this has to be argued about, and this has to be debated and discussed. And what we think here is that what we propose, the model we propose, justifies the existence of the institution where this debate would happen. I don't know if I explained myself, and I hope I answered your question. Yes, go on.
Alrighty, thank you so much for the presentation. I have a question about the first contractualists, and I think like this eventually goes into the idea of the second one that you've been talking about. So for the first contractualists, it's very important to set up an idea of equality, right, to go beyond the state of nature. But in many ways, they just present the idea and they don't justify it fully, right? For example, Rousseau in The Social Contract says that men in the state of nature is just like a thought experiment, that he cannot prove that it is an actual thing. And Hobbes, when he's defending or when he's presenting, the equality of men in chapter 13 of the Leviathan, says that we're all equal because we can all outsmart each other and have the same strength of body. But you can imagine a variety of cases where that argument is not enough. So I was wondering for for this second social contract, what are the bases for equality? If they're actually stronger than the ones presented by the first contractualists.
Well, thank you very much for your question. I think this question also goes along with what I said at the beginning, that I couldn't sadly review all the work that I would have loved to review, for example, when it comes to the theory of contractualism. So I'll try to answer as best as I can, because, for example, I'm not aware of what's going on chapter 13 of Hobbes' Leviathan, though I would really love to. So I think that I can speak of the second social contract. I think this is a very, very interesting question, and it goes on what I would have to work on a deeper level, which is I think it's also comprehended in the moral basis of the contract as well, because if there's any justification for equality here, as well as it's for freedom, it's an ethical one. So I think the basis of equality here is it has to do with the fact that everyone is an end in itself. So that's what's equal to everyone. And that is also, I just think, I actually think it just comes logically that if we understand that the people that are in privileged states where they have their rights and freedom fulfilled, the rationale for them to have that condition is that they're humans and that's their right as a person. Why would not everyone else have them if they're also people? The only thing that is impeding that, well, there's many things impeding that, of course, but here we're focusing on the kind of political community and on the concrete political community they form a part of. So in which they're not considered as ends in themselves in the Kantian vocabulary, and they're basically not considered to be entitled to those rights and liberties. But the reason why other people are is it also applies to them. So I think this is I know it's very logical, and maybe I really wanna dig more into this in my further research. So I really am taking notes of your questions. So I think this is where I would in a very sketched way justify equality in the contract. Also, obviously, it depends on what kind of equality we're talking about, because there are many kinds of equality. This is a very basic one, but at the end of the day, it's what I said at the end of the presentation. It's a right to have rights. So that's where the equality is, because obviously everyone is going to be in a different situation. Even if we turned everyone a democratic state, it would be different. But what has remained equal is the right to have rights, which is to have rights and to be entitled to, because the people who have those rights are just having them because of their humanity. So I think that's where I would locate the basis of equality. I hope I answered a bit your question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, I don't know if anyone else has any other question, but well, I'm really thankful for the questions, because I really didn't have the chance to talk about this with anyone, because my uni just has econometrics and economics. So there's no subject where I could develop this rather than on my own, and just the subject I made this work for. So it's really enriching for me. So thank you very much for your questions. And I think if no one else has a question, maybe we can leave it here. Okay, so should I, well, I think Nestor, you have to do it maybe, to stop the recording, or?
Yeah, I will do it. Thank you so
Okay.
much for coming.
Thank you so much.